We welcome the view of others. We seek a free flow of information. We are not afraid to entrust the American people with unpleasant facts. For a nation that is afraid to let its people judge the truth and falsehood in an open market is a nation that is afraid of its people.
Hello, my name is Doug Horne, and I worked for the JFK Assassination Records Review Board from August of 1995 through September of 1998. Dramatic new photographic evidence has recently surfaced that helps to better illuminate the controversial subject of the three separate and well-documented Bethesda Naval Hospital casket entries the night of November 22, 1963. This provides the perfect opportunity to revisit the subject of the three Bethesda casket entries on November 22nd. And in fact, this new photographic evidence makes it mandatory that we all closely re-examine the documented timeline here, so that the photographs are not interpreted incorrectly. A cursory or quick and dirty interpretation of these new images would be unacceptable, for to interpret them without care and precision would introduce unneeded confusion and controversy into an already challenging subject. And the subject, the chain of custody of President Kennedy's body prior to the start of the autopsy of record shortly after 8 p.m. on November 22nd, is of profound importance. Before I begin this discussion, I would like to thank the three persons who approached me on the grassy knoll in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 2024, and showed me these new images on their smartphone screens. They are Matt Douthit, Will O'Halloran, and Alex Harris. Two of them, Matt Douthit and Will O'Halloran, revisited me the following day at the conference where I was speaking and showed me the material a second time on a laptop screen so that I could see the images better than I was able to the day before on tiny smartphone screens in the bright sunlight on the grassy knoll. What they showed me were, first, screen grabs or single frames from brief ABC News video library film clips with the emphasis on several Navy sailors at night, photographed in a loading dock area in close proximity to a black Cadillac hearse. And second, two extremely clear still photographs taken at night of both a gray Navy ambulance and a gray Navy pickup truck parked in a narrow loading dock driveway with what appeared to be the Joint Service Casket Team, or JFK Honor Guard, and other individuals, U.S. Marines, two naval officers, and others in the background of the photograph, as the bronze Dallas casket was being taken from the loading dock platform immediately behind the two parked vehicles through a door into the hospital. To say that the images shown to me were electrifying would be a gross understatement. Following my return from Dallas, I located, with the invaluable assistance of a new research colleague, the images these three researchers showed to me in Dallas, and additional related images online. Two separate ABC film clips, one 17 minutes long and one 3 minutes 11 seconds in length, were found online at a location called ABC News Video Source. There was additional imagery in one of the two ABC News video source clips that I do not recall seeing in Dallas. This additional imagery included motion picture footage of a gray Navy ambulance out in front of Bethesda Naval Hospital. My colleague and I also located on one of the oft-used online photo archives the two aforementioned exceptionally clear still images of what appeared to be the 8 o'clock p.m. casket entry of the bronze Dallas casket from a gray Navy ambulance accompanied by a gray Navy pickup truck, with the Honor Guard in the background. My colleague and I purchased the commercial rights to these two exceptionally clear black and white still images of what appeared to be the 8 o'clock p.m. casket entry. The two still images appear to be in a 4-inch by 5-inch aspect ratio and may well have been taken with a large format professional camera, that is, a speed graphic or press camera. You will see all of the images discussed above again, later in this presentation, but first it is imperative that I lay the foundation for my discussion and analysis of what the images depict by reconstructing for you the already solid documentation for 3 distinct and separate casket entries into Bethesda Naval Hospital the night of November 22, 1963. Once we have reviewed the already robust evidence for the 3 casket entries, we can begin a microanalysis of what the new photographic images depict and what they do not depict. This part of the presentation is about the first casket entry. I'm going to begin this subject by reading verbatim excerpts of what Navy Corpsman Dennis David told author David Lifton in 1979 and 1980. These excerpts come from Chapter 25 of Lifton's book, Best Evidence.
A helicopter is standing by just near the presidential jet to take the coffin away. It is our understanding here that the body will be flown by helicopter from here, possibly to Bethesda Naval Hospital.
There is some difference of opinion as to the exact plans.
HM1 Dennis David, an E6 Navy corpsman, who is filling the role of Chief of the Day at the Bethesda Medical School on November 22, 1963, assembled 7 or 8 sailors to unload a cheap, simple casket from a hearse at the morgue loading dock. He did not physically assist with the unloading himself, but instead supervised his working party of sailors. Quote, "It came in a black Cadillac ambulance without any markings. There was no escort with it. There was just the 2 attendants in front, and there were 6 or 7 men who, I assume they were Secret Service, who were in back with the casket. They opened it up. They got out, and they, along with some of the sailors, unloaded the casket, and they took it into the morgue proper." I'm sure you've seen a number of funerals with a black hearse in front. That's what it was, if you want to call it a hearse. There were just these 6, 7 or 8 big men in the back with the casket who were in civilian clothes. I assumed they were Secret Service. There were just 2 attendants. They were both wearing white smocks. End quote. Dennis David assured David Lifton that when the hearse arrived, many senior officers were present on the loading dock where he could see them. Quote, "Dr. Boswell and Dr. Humes, plus the chief of the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery was there, and the chiefs of the Army and Air Force medical departments were already there at the morgue." End quote. Dennis David continued, quote, "I was told by the doctor that the body was in the first casket that night." Lifton, "Who said that to you?" David, "Dr. Boswell." Lifton, "Boswell said the body was in the first casket?" David, "Yep." Lifton, "In other words, Boswell knew there were 2 caskets?" David, "Right." Lifton, "He told you this then?" David, "Well, he told me that the body came in the casket, the one when I was down there." Lifton, "We're talking about the morgue jetty, are we not?" David, "Yes." End quote. HM1 Dennis David explained that the gray Navy ambulance from Andrews Air Force Base, quote, "came in at the front entrance of Bethesda, and then went on around and went back to the loading dock. I was not there when it came in to the morgue loading dock. It was, 15-30 minutes after the other casket had arrived." End quote. In his 1997 interview with the ARRB staff, Dennis David told me that the Andrews Air Force Base motorcade, including the gray Navy ambulance containing the ornate bronze Dallas casket seen in the Andrews Air Force Base movie and video footage, arrived out in front of the hospital about 30 minutes after he and his Navy sailors unloaded the cheap gray shipping casket from a black hearse and set it down in the morgue anteroom. This was very consistent with what he told David Lifton in 1979 and 1980. The sequencing of the two events remained the same in his ARRB account. The shipping casket delivered by the black hearse to the loading dock at the rear of the hospital arrived well before the Andrews Air Force Base motorcade, out in front of Bethesda Naval Hospital on Wisconsin Avenue. Dennis David explained to David Lifton that he didn't actually see the second gray Navy ambulance arrive at the loading dock, only at the front of the hospital. He made clear to Lifton that the first vehicle, the black Cadillac hearse, definitely delivered JFK's body, according to Dr. Boswell. This is why he told Lifton he knew the casket in the gray Navy ambulance had to be empty when it arrived between 15 and 30 minutes later out in front of Bethesda Naval Hospital on Wisconsin Avenue. Quote, "After I was down at the back, after the black ambulance was there, then I went back up to the front of the Naval Medical Center, to the commanding officer's office. I was in the office and was standing there looking out toward Wisconsin Avenue when the motorcade with the Navy ambulance came in the front gate. This was like 15 or 20, 30 minutes after the black ambulance had arrived." End quote. Early in 1981, following the publication of Lifton's best evidence, an important witness surfaced who corroborated the essentials of Dennis David's account. It was Donald Rebentish, a Navy petty officer who had been a member of Dennis David's working party. Rebentish was quoted in a UPI story in the Miami Herald newspaper on January 25, 1981. Quote, "It was about 4:30 when our chief petty officer came to me and about 5 other petty officers and told us to go to the back of the hospital. I'm talking about the loading ramps where they used to bring in supplies. He told all of us that we were going to be there and we were going to bring the president's casket into the morgue. The chief said, 'We got all the ghouls and reporters and the TV and everybody at the front of the hospital.' He said there would be an empty casket in the ambulance. He said the president's body would really come in the back. We took the casket out and pushed it down a long illuminated hall. Now this was a service area, not the main part of the hospital." End quote. Lifton also interviewed Donald Rebentish in 1981 and learned that the sequence of events recalled by Rebentish was the same as that recalled by Dennis David. Lifton wrote in a subsequent edition of Best Evidence, quote, "He provided corroboration for Dennis David's account by recalling that he had helped unload the first casket, an ordinary shipping casket, and that it had arrived at the back before the gray Navy ambulance arrived at the front. Rebentish said that after unloading the first casket, he went upstairs to the lobby area of Bethesda, where he saw Mrs. Kennedy, who had just arrived in the Navy ambulance, waiting for the elevator." End quote. The Boyjan Report, written by the sergeant in charge of the Marine Security Detail of Bethesda and obtained from him by the ARRB, provides a precise time for the arrival of the cheap casket that Dennis David and his sailors offloaded. It puts an unmistakable time marker on the event Dennis David so vividly described to David Lifton in 1979 on audio tape and 1980 on film. Now this graphic explains the context for what is described in the Boyjan Report and for what Dennis David saw 20 or 30 minutes later in front of the hospital. At 6:35 p.m., that's 1835 hours military time, the shipping casket arrived at the loading dock and was offloaded by Dennis David's working party of Navy sailors. At 6:55 p.m., per Secret Service Agent Glenn Hill's written report, the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base arrived at the front of Bethesda. At 7:07 p.m. or later, The Navy ambulance moved away from the front of the hospital and was driven around to the back of the hospital to the morgue. Per one media report, the casket sat unmoving for at least 12 minutes after Jackie Kennedy entered the front of Bethesda Naval Hospital. This is a screen grab of 3 of Sergeant Boyjan's Marines, taken from motion picture footage shot inside Bethesda Naval Hospital the night of the autopsy. They were part of the security detail from the Marine barracks in Washington, D.C. They reported to Rear Admiral Calvin Galloway, the commanding officer of the National Naval Medical Center at Bethesda, at 6 o'clock p.m., well before the black Cadillac hearse arrived at 6:35 p.m. Their job was not ceremonial. Rather, their assignment was to provide physical security for events inside and around the morgue that evening. Exactly 20 minutes elapsed between the casket arrival time in the Boyjan report, 6:35 p.m., and the arrival of the Andrews Air Force Base motorcade, documented by Secret Service reports and the media, at 6:55 p.m., confirming the reliability of HM1 Dennis David's independent recollections to both David Lifton and to the ARRB. In short, the Boyjan report not only pins a precise time on when the shipping casket was offloaded at the rear of the hospital, but when compared with Secret Service and media reports of when the Andrews Air Force Base motorcade arrived out front, it confirms the sequencing of the 2 events in Dennis David's account. I have always considered Dennis David to be among the most reliable of all of the JFK medical eyewitnesses, and the Boyjan report backstops my assessment of his veracity and reliability. David Lifton queried Dennis David about what the first casket, the one his men offloaded from the black hearse, looked like. Quote, David, it was a gray metal casket, just a gray, fairly plain gray metal casket. Lifton, it definitely was not a polished bronze casket? David, no, it wasn't. It was a gray metal casket I saw. Lifton, you saw Humes and Boswell when the first casket arrived? David, right. And let's see, there was one other man, John Stover, Captain Stover, who was commanding officer of the medical school. End quote. Dennis David is describing here what is called a shipping casket in the parlance of the funeral trade, a cheap, unadorned metal container used to move bodies on trains and airplanes. It bears no resemblance whatsoever to the ornate, ceremonial dark bronze coffin transported from Dallas. You can see how markedly different the Dallas bronze casket looks from a typical shipping casket. And indeed, there is a contemporaneous document made by Gawler's funeral home personnel the night of the autopsy that records the delivery of a metal shipping casket to Bethesda Naval Hospital the night of the autopsy. The shipping casket notation on the Gawler's first call sheet was written by Mr. Joe Hagan, the Gawler's funeral home supervisor that night. He confirmed to me that a shipping casket, in the parlance of the funeral trade, was a cheap, unadorned transport container used to move bodies on trains and airplanes. There are additional shipping casket witnesses beyond Dennis David and the Gawler's first call sheet. To begin with, Navy Corpsman Floyd Reeby and Jim Jenkins both described the container JFK arrived in to David Lifton in ways clearly consistent with a shipping casket. And Navy Corpsman Paul O'Connor is the first known witness to use the phrase shipping casket, which he employed during his 1977 interview with the HSCA staff, long before he ever met David Lifton. O'Connor was qualified to use that description since he had worked for a funeral home and knew what he was talking about. Navy Captain John Stover, the commanding officer of the Bethesda Medical School, told Lifton that JFK's body arrived in a, quote, transport coffin, end quote. Furthermore, Navy Corpsman Ed Reed, testified to the ARRB in 1997 that JFK's body arrived in, quote, a typical military aluminum casket, end quote, made of, quote, stainless steel or aluminum, end quote. Floyd Reeby testified to the ARRB in 1997 that the casket JFK arrived in was, quote, gunmetal gray, end quote, with a, quote, dull finish, end quote, and was, quote, plain and inexpensive, end quote. Finally, Paul O'Connor told David Lifton that JFK's casket featured, quote, head screws, end quote, on the top of the lid. And Floyd Reeby told Lifton he recalled seeing ugly, quote, turnbuckles with thumb screws, end quote, to hold the lid on. Reeby recalled consistently that the cheap casket did not have a viewing lid like a burial coffin, and that the shipping casket's lid came off all in one piece. Finally, Dennis David summarized the key points in his timeline. Quote, I would stand absolutely firm on the fact that the black ambulance arrived well before. The black ambulance was there, and I saw it arrive, and then I went back up front, and I saw the gray Navy ambulance come in with the motorcade off Wisconsin Avenue. That is definite. End quote. I want to make a point here, and it is very important. Some researchers, for various reasons involving their desired interpretation of events that night at Bethesda, want to assume that JFK's body was not in the cheap shipping casket delivered in the black hearse at 6:35 p.m. Some of them want to believe that the shipping casket contained the body of an Air Force major. Others want to believe it was a different corpse, the body of neither the rumored Air Force major nor that of JFK. Anyone who refuses to accept that JFK's body was in the shipping casket delivered at 6:35 p.m. in the black hearse is in denial of a basic fact, namely that Dr. Boswell confirmed to Dennis David that JFK had been in the shipping casket that he and his men offloaded at 6:35 p.m. Denial of this basic fact inevitably invalidates and destroys any analysis of events that evening that springs from that stubborn denial. Furthermore, consider this. Marine Corps Sergeant Boyjan was sent to Bethesda solely to provide physical security for the body of JFK during the autopsy. He would not have recorded the arrival of a casket, what his report calls the casket, unless he was confident in his belief that it was the body of President Kennedy, just as Dennis David was informed by the Secret Service to assemble his working party because, quote, your visitor is about to arrive, end quote. Sergeant Boyjan would have been similarly informed about JFK's impending arrival by the Secret Service. Otherwise, he and his men would not have been present on the loading dock to provide physical security, and otherwise he would not have recorded the time of the casket's arrival. Now that I have definitively established the reality of the first casket entry at Bethesda Naval Hospital on November 22, 1963, I want to briefly address how JFK's body arrived in a shipping casket at 6:35 p.m., 20 minutes before the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base. The Air Force One audio tapes, recorded while Air Force One was airborne between Love Field and Andrews Air Force Base, reveal that the head of the Secret Service White House detail, Jerry Bain, directed that JFK's autopsy would be at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and that his body would be transported there by helicopter. Jerry Bain first revealed this plan to Rear Admiral Berkeley, JFK's military physician, as follows.
Air Force One, Andrew, duplex is on, sir.
Duplex is on, this is Dr. Berkeley. What arrangements have been made? Starts the reception of the President.
Everybody aboard Air Force One, everyone aboard Air Force One, with the exception of the body, will be choppered into the south ground. The body will be choppered to the Naval Medical Center at Bethesda. Over.
The body will be choppered or will go by ambulance to the Naval Medical Center?
Will be choppered. Will be choppered.
Bain then repeated this instruction to General Clifton, JFK's military aide.
Watchman, been arranged to helicopter the body to Bethesda. Over.
And finally, in a radio conversation with Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman, Bain issued one final instruction.
Digest, this is Duplex. You accompany the body aboard the helicopter.
Roger.
In his seminal 1967 work, Death of a President, author William Manchester made clear that the Secret Service plan to helicopter everyone except JFK's body to the south grounds of the White House lawn was overruled by the president's widow, Jackie Kennedy. After Air Force One came to a stop on the tarmac of Andrews Air Force Base at 6:04 p.m., Manchester writes that Jackie noticed the cardiac ambulance that had pulled up next to the airplane. It had been sent to meet Air Force One by Captain Canada, the commanding officer of the treatment hospital at Bethesda, because of a rumor that LBJ had suffered another heart attack. Gazing at the vehicle, Jackie said, quote, "We'll go in that," end quote, thus vetoing plans to separate her and all other members of the Kennedy entourage from the casket by sending all of them to the south grounds of the White House via 3 helicopters. Kellerman, who had to improvise, stayed with the Dallas casket in the Navy cardiac ambulance during the 45-minute drive to Bethesda Naval Hospital. The Dallas casket was empty, and Kellerman had to remain with it to ensure that this fact was not discovered. JFK's body was surreptitiously transported by helicopter, as originally planned, as soon as LBJ departed Andrews in Army 1, and the television lights were extinguished.
Will be choppered. Will be choppered.
I get them out there anyways, reverse, and then get them out there anyways, reverse. So they so big that way.
Liberty under standby 1, please.
Navy Corpsman Paul O'Connor told author William Law that he heard a helicopter land in the Officers Club parking lot behind the Naval Hospital shortly before the shipping casket was brought into the morgue. This is documented in Law's 2004 book, In the Eye of History. O'Connor told Law he also heard another helicopter land that night at the front of the hospital, where the helipad was located. This clearly would have been the H-21 Army helo carrying the casket team. The clandestine helicopter transportation of JFK's body is hinted at in this November 27, 1963 newspaper article in a Rockville, Maryland newspaper. Apparently, the helicopter carrying the shipping casket landed at the helipad first, but then quickly departed for an unobserved location, the Officers Club parking lot. The second helo referenced in the article would have been the H-21 helo transporting the casket team, which landed at 6:45 p.m. In his 2015 book, From Parkland to Bethesda, author Vince Palomara documents how a Navy nurse witnessed a simple casket arrive by helicopter, accompanied by men in trench coats. She told journalist Woody Woodland in 1992 that she was informed that this was the delivery of the president's body. The identity of the nurse, a Navy ensign, was kept confidential by Woodland at her request. It seems clear to me that the Bethesda nurse witnessed the arrival of JFK's body at or near the Officers Club parking lot. Clearly, about 5 minutes later at 6:35 p.m., the simple casket that she recalled was delivered by a black hearse to the loading dock as previously discussed. The 2 pages shown here are from the U.S. Army's file on the state funeral of John F. Kennedy, found at the JFK Library in Boston, Massachusetts. They both confirm with contemporaneous documentary evidence what Jerry Bain said to Roy Kellerman on the Air Force One tapes, namely that JFK's body would be moved by helicopter from Andrews to Bethesda Naval Hospital. Most importantly, the Army's estimate of the time of arrival of the helicopter, namely 1830 hours or 6:30 p.m., is entirely consistent with the arrival time of JFK's body in the shipping casket delivered by the black hearse at 1835 hours on November 22, 1963. In other words, the second document proves conclusively that there was time to move JFK's body from Andrews to Bethesda via helicopter in time for the arrival time noted in the Boysen report. Now let's revisit the second casket entry that night at Bethesda Naval Hospital. At approximately 7:17 p.m., the ornate bronze Dallas casket from Parkland Hospital was taken from a gray Navy ambulance into the morgue anteroom by 4 federal agents. FBI agents Francis O'Neill and James Sibert, and Secret Service agents Roy Kellerman and William Greer. This event was described to the HSCA staff by Sibert and O'Neill in 1977 and 1978, as shown here. FBI agents James Sibert and Francis O'Neill were directed to attend JFK's autopsy, obtain any bullets or bullet fragments removed from his body during the autopsy, and deliver them to the FBI laboratory.
The ambulance moved in the front of the hospital. Now, bear in mind, I'm familiar with the hospital there, and so is Jim, because we took our physical examinations there every year, so we were familiar with a good portion of the hospital itself. Mrs. Kennedy got out, Bobby Kennedy got out. Kellerman went into the hospital, and Bobby Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy, and probably Berkeley, went in and went up to either the 17th or 19th floor.
The gray Navy ambulance had sat unmoving out in front of Bethesda Naval Hospital for at least 12 minutes after Jackie Kennedy entered the front door of Bethesda Naval Hospital.
And now we have Larry O'Brien and Kenny O'Donnell and McHugh and chatting in front of the place. So they were there for a period of time, and Jim and I are looking at each other. There was a period of time there, Jim and I looked at each other, and we decided to find out what the story was. So we went up to Larry O'Brien and said, "What's the delay?" And as best I recalled, he said, "Well, they don't know." Greer was the driver of the ambulance, where the autopsy room was. So both Jim and I said, "Well, we know where it is." So we drove around the back, and the ambulance drove around the back too. So we drove around the back. The ambulance stopped. And round in back, coming out of the wing and the corridor, put it that way, where the autopsy room was, and you come out of the corridor, and then you have a door, a swinging door, and then you have sort of a little platform there. Kellerman was coming out of there, so we went around. The ambulance stopped. So we got out of our car. We went over to the ambulance. I saw Kellerman coming on out, and I went over to him, and I said, "My name is Frank O'Neill, I'm FBI agent." He says, "I know. I've already got a call from Raleigh that you're going to be here." So he and I and Jim and Greer opened the back of the ambulance. So we took the casket out and put it on a conveyance. But up to the doors here, there's a door on the left-hand side. Pushed it in there, which is a small anteroom. In the anteroom were some slots. It was sort of a morgue. It was a morgue that they used for the hospital.
We were right there before it was taken out of the ambulance, and when I had my conversation with Roy Kellerman, and we helped carry it into the autopsy room.
Could you describe how that happened? Now we're referring to a gray Navy ambulance. Mm-hmm. Is that fair?
That's good.
Okay. Were you there when the door was open to the ambulance?
The rear door?
The rear door.
Yes.
And who helped lift the casket out of the ambulance?
Of course, I've read some stuff about teams and stuff, and I don't have any recollection of any teams. I recall there was Kellerman and Greer, and there was a driver, O'Neill and myself, but we carried it through the door and right on into the autopsy room. Sort of an ante room there, I think.
Were there any military officials who helped unload the casket with you, as best you recall?
I can't recall that either.
After Secret Service agent Greer, who was following the two FBI agents, drove the gray Navy ambulance around to the morgue loading dock, 4 federal agents alone, Kellerman, Greer, Sibert, and O'Neill, offloaded the empty Dallas casket by putting it on a church truck, an accordion-like device with wheels designed to move heavy caskets, and taking it into the morgue anteroom. This was a distinctly different event from the delivery of the shipping casket at 6:35 p.m., where the principal actors were 8 Navy sailors. The only actors at this second casket entry were 4 men in suits, federal agents. The approximate time for the delivery of the Dallas casket to the morgue anteroom was 7:17 p.m., as hinted at in an FBI document written by Special Agent Rosen. Rosen was documenting an interview conducted in 1964 between Arlen Specter of the Warren Commission staff and FBI agents Sibert and O'Neill. It seems to document the time that they first tried to enter the morgue autopsy room. The 2 FBI agents wrote a report on November 26, 1963, about events at JFK's autopsy, in which they described an apparent altercation between them and the Secret Service as soon as they brought the Dallas casket into the morgue anteroom. Quote, "Bureau agents assisted in the moving of the casket to the autopsy room. A tight security was immediately placed around the autopsy room by the Naval Facility and the U.S. Secret Service. Bureau agents made contact with Mr. Roy Kellerman, the Assistant Secret Service agent in charge of the White House detail, and advised him of the Bureau's interest in this matter. He advised that he had already received instructions from Director Rowley as to the presence of the Bureau agents." End quote. This is bureaucratic language documenting the fact that there was a verbal altercation between the FBI agents and Roy Kellerman as soon as the Dallas casket was set down in the morgue anteroom. David Lifton correctly inferred that Sibert and O'Neill and the Dallas casket were denied immediate entrance into the morgue examination room. Although Sibert and O'Neill later denied that they were immediately barred from entering the morgue, a CBS document that was written in 1967, which quotes the lead pathologist, Dr. Humes, confirms that the 2 FBI agents were kept outside the morgue in an anteroom for an unspecified amount of time. So while we do not have photographs of the second casket entry on November 22, 1963, it is well documented in both the HSCA interview reports of Sibert and O'Neill, in their ARRB depositions, and in their own FD 302 report of events at the autopsy. Neither their FD 302 report nor their HSCA interviews mention any members of the Joint Service Casket Team or Honor Guard or Navy sailors in dark working uniforms assisting them. Their HSCA interviews make it clear that the casket entry they participated in at the morgue loading dock was carried out by 4 federal agents with no one else assisting. This segment is about the Joint Service Casket Team. The ambulance chase they were involved in on the grounds of Bethesda Naval Hospital, their subsequent discovery of an empty Navy ambulance at the morgue loading dock, their return to the front of the hospital, their subsequent rediscovery of the Dallas casket inside a gray Navy ambulance in front of the hospital shortly before 8 o'clock p.m., and their delivery of the Dallas casket to the morgue at precisely 2000 hours military time, or 8 o'clock p.m., per their after-action report. A Joint Service Casket Team, composed of members of all of the armed services and 1 Coast Guard member, was formed at Andrews Air Force Base the evening of November 22, 1963, prior to the arrival of Air Force One at 6 o'clock p.m. The casket team's mission was to serve as pallbearers and an honor guard. This casket team consisted on Friday evening of 6 pallbearers working under the immediate supervision of their officer in charge, First Lieutenant Samuel R. Byrd, United States Army. Byrd reported that weekend directly to the Commandant of the Military District of Washington, Major General Philip C. Wheel, United States Army. Alongside Wheel that night was his aide, Army Lieutenant Richard Lipsey. On Friday evening, the casket team consisted of 6 members, plus their officer in charge, Lieutenant Byrd. Additional members were added during the weekend to assist, as you can see in this photo taken on Sunday, November 24th. Shortly after the light gray Navy ambulance containing the Dallas casket and Jackie and Robert Kennedy drove away from Air Force One at 6:10 p.m. en route Bethesda Naval Hospital, General Wheel, his aide Lieutenant Lipsey, the officer in charge Lieutenant Byrd, and the 6 pallbearers on the casket team all got on board a U.S. Army H-21 helicopter for the trip to Bethesda and arrived there at about 6:45 p.m. at the helipad out in front of the hospital. Since the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base had not arrived yet, General Wheel waited for the motorcade in a staff car, while Byrd and his 6 pallbearers waited in a light gray Navy pickup truck. The important thing to remember about this casket team is how differently they were dressed in their respective dress uniforms, from the 8 sailors in dark navy blue working uniforms with Dixie cup hats who offloaded the shipping casket at 6:35, and from the 4 federal agents, men in suits, who later offloaded the empty Dallas casket at about 7:17 p.m. The Joint Service Casket Team was destined to take the Dallas casket into the morgue later that evening at 8 o'clock p.m., 2000 hours military time, following a considerable amount of confusion, during which they got separated from the ambulance they were following and got lost in the darkness. That story now ensues. The 2 people in Army service dress greens seen in front of Bethesda appear to be Major General Wheel and his aide, Lieutenant Richard Lipsey. Note that the Army aide is carrying 2 briefcases, probably his own and the General's. General Wheel's aide, Richard Lipsey, told both the HSCA and author David Lifton that there was a, quote, decoy ambulance, end quote, used that night for security reasons. One at the front of the motorcade, in which Jacqueline Kennedy had ridden, and one much farther back. Quote, Lifton, whose plan was it to have two ambulances? Lipsey, you got me. I don't remember. Lifton, I mean, was it your plan? Lipsey, not mine. Lifton, was it General Wheel's? Lipsey, I doubt it. I think that came from the White House. Lifton, okay. Did you hear the word that night? Decoy ambulance? Lipsey, absolutely, yes. Lifton, absolutely? Lipsey, yes. Who did you hear it from? Lipsey, I don't remember. We heard that at Andrews Air Force Base. We had a little meeting. We were in a little room at Andrews and had a meeting before the plane ever landed, and these plans were formulated. It was strictly a security measure. End quote. Lipsey admitted to Lifton that his belief in 1978 and 1979 that there was no casket in Jackie Kennedy's ambulance was based on what had been discussed at Andrews in the security meeting, not on what he saw at Bethesda. Earlier, on April 7, 1967, Lifton had interviewed General Wheel. Back in 1967, Wheel had also told Lifton there were two gray Navy ambulances. Wheel said, quote, the second ambulance took off. It was indicated we should follow it, and when we got there, to its destination, the morgue loading dock, we went right over and saw what the problem was and immediately came back. End quote. Lifton asked Wheel whether the second ambulance had remained at the rear of the hospital. Wheel responded, quote, I don't know whether it remained there or not, but it drew up there all right. End quote. William Manchester, author of the book The Death of a President, interviewed both First Lieutenant Samuel Byrd and General Philip Wheel in April of 1964. Based on the information they gave him, he wrote the following account in his book on page 399 of the cloth edition. Quote, General Wheel had stationed himself beyond the cornerstone in a staff car, with Lieutenant Byrd and his body bearers right behind him in a truck. They had observed Mrs. Kennedy's arrival, but the darkness, the great blocks of silent people, and the many moving vehicles distracted them. It had confused two naval physicians, too. When an ambulance drew away from the curb, they called, That's it, we'll guide you to the morgue. At the morgue, Wheel, Byrd, and the 6 enlisted men debarked and inspected each other's uniforms while awaiting some movement from the ambulance. It was still as still. The lieutenant crept up and peered inside. It was empty. Even the driver had gone. Panicky, they fled back and saw, among the shining cat's eyes, the uneasy face of Godfrey McHugh. Wheel and Byrd colored. The military district of Washington was meticulous about ceremony. For a casket team to leave a commander-in-chief's casket was an astounding lapse, and after casting about bitterly and vainly for the two doctors, they reformed the tiny escort. End quote. William Manchester failed to reveal what happened to the casket team before they found the empty Navy gray ambulance at the morgue loading dock. Perhaps because General Wheel and Lieutenant Byrd didn't tell him about it. As Lifton's interviews with other members of the casket team reveal, an ambulance chase ensued in the darkness as soon as the casket team departed from the front of the hospital, following the second Navy gray ambulance. And the casket team led by Wheel and Byrd got lost, before eventually finding an empty ambulance at the loading dock, as documented by Manchester. The empty ambulance the casket team found at the loading dock was most certainly the one that had been driven to the loading dock by William Greer at least 12 minutes after Jackie Kennedy went inside Bethesda Naval Hospital. The 4 federal agents had already gone inside and taken the Dallas casket with them. This is why the casket team found the Navy ambulance empty, with no casket inside and no driver or anyone else in attendance. This would place the arrival of the casket team at the empty ambulance sometime after 7:17 p.m. Clearly, the sequence was this. The decoy ambulance would have departed from the rear of the motorcade first, which is why the casket team followed it. As soon as that happened, it was then safe for Greer to drive around to the morgue loading dock with the empty Dallas casket without having the casket team follow him. Greer and Kellerman certainly knew the Dallas casket was empty at this time, but Sibert and O'Neill surely did not. David Lifton's interviews with casket team members revealed that there was indeed an ambulance chase in the darkness, and that the casket team got lost and separated from the Navy ambulance they were chasing. William Manchester's book only recorded what happened after the ambulance chase. The casket team found an empty Navy ambulance at the morgue loading dock, but Lifton's interviews revealed much more, namely what had happened before the casket team found the empty ambulance at the loading dock. On November 19, 1967, former Marine Lance Corporal Timothy Cheek told Lifton, quote, "I believe we did follow the wrong one around to the back, and then we did come around to the front again, after we found that it wasn't the right one. All I know is that we finally caught it, and it was at the morgue door," end quote. Former Army Sergeant James Felder told Lifton on November 20, 1967, quote, "There were 2 ambulances. One was supposed to be the decoy. We got out of the helicopter and onto the truck. Then the truck took us to the front, and they said, 'No, we'll unload it to the back to get away from the crowd.' Well, they left one out front, and they sent another one around back, another ambulance. They were using 2 of them. We saw the 2 ambulances. Byrd and General Wheel discussed this. It was Navy strategy because it was their ambulance that was being used. I don't know who made the decision to have them, but we know 2 were there, and we were told one was used for a decoy anticipating the crowd and this sort of thing." End quote. After exhibiting considerable confusion about which ambulance the casket team followed around to the back, Felder said, quote, "We followed that ambulance. At least we attempted to follow that ambulance. We lost it, and we made a couple of turns, and then we got to turn around and come back again." End quote. Lifton asked, "What vehicle did you drive?" Felder responded that it was a pickup truck. Lifton continued, "Okay, so you tried to follow this ambulance?" Felder said, quote, "Right," end quote. Lifton responded, "And you lose it?" Felder confirmed, quote, "We lose it. It's a huge complex there," end quote. Lifton tried to clarify, "In other words, you're trying to follow this ambulance and you lose it?" Felder, quote, "That's right," end quote. Lifton, "Now when you lost this ambulance, what did you do?" Felder said they returned to the front of the hospital where, quote, "there was another ambulance," end quote. Felder made clear that at one point there were 2 ambulances in front of the hospital and said it was, quote, "confusing," end quote, as to which ambulance contained the body. Felder continued, quote, "We just waited there for a while, and then finally Byrd said, 'Well, I think they're moving the right one back there now.' We got back on the truck and rode around back, and by the time we got there, the ambulance was getting off, and then we removed the body," end quote. Felder recalled that Lieutenant Byrd said, "One is being used for a decoy." Lifton asked, "Now the point is you didn't know there was a second one until you lost the first one?" Felder responded, quote, "That's right," end quote. Lifton stated, "So this conversation where the explanation is given has to occur after you see 2 ambulances?" Felder said, quote, "Apparently it did because he, Byrd, left us there for a while and he went to communicate with some of the higher brass and a couple of other people. And that's when he came back. He said they was using a decoy," end quote. Felder said that the conversations between Wheel and Byrd occurred on the sidewalk, quote, "not very far away," end quote, and that Wheel was with an aide. He stressed that the word decoy was used by Byrd. but that it had been passed on to Byrd by Wheel, quote, or whoever was with Wheel, end quote. Lifton contacted Lieutenant Byrd, but could not conduct a meaningful interview because Byrd had sustained brain damage after being wounded in the head in Vietnam. Lifton obtained Byrd's casket team report on November 24, 1967, and it read, quote, from the ambulance to the morgue, 2000 hours, 22 November, 63, end quote. Byrd had also written, quote, after considerable confusion as to where the president's body would be taken, the joint casket team removed the casket from the ambulance at the mortuary entrance to the hospital, end quote, thus telescoping all of the confusion that night into one sentence. On December 16, 1967, Lifton contacted former Army Spec 4 Douglas Mayfield. Mayfield said, quote, we went around to the back, and then we waited there, and the ambulance didn't come around right away. And we went back around to the front, and by this time, they were just leaving. So then we followed it around, and when it stopped and back, we took it, the casket, out and took it inside, end quote. On December 19, 1967, Lifton spoke with former Navy Seaman Apprentice Hubert Clark, who told him, quote, first we went to the front, and it wasn't there, so we went to the back. It seemed like we were running practically, running after a lost coffin. This is the way it seemed to me. As a matter of fact, this is the way it was. I think there was a decoy, supposedly to get the people away from the hospital. It was like a decoy was set up, where we were supposed to go one way, and this decoy ambulance, I believe, went another way to the front, end quote. Clark then seemed to recall chasing an ambulance in the dark, quote, I think the ambulance took off again into the crowd. I think that's the one we, actually went into pursuit of the ambulance. And I remember driving some distance. I don't know whether we were looking for the morgue or whether this was a way of decoying, to get away from the crowd. I remember going some distance in the back of the truck because we were cold, end quote. Lifton, quote, as you were pursuing it, do you remember losing it and having to return to the front to get your bearings again, end quote. Clark, quote, we lost it, end quote. Lifton, quote, you lost it, end quote. Clark, quote, right, I think we did, end quote. Clark continued, quote, we were saying, now where the hell is he? Where did he go? Why is he speeding? We're talking about the guy, whoever is driving that ambulance, and we were trying to figure it out. Well, why is he going so fast? We're going to lose him. This is what our conversation was, end quote. Lifton asked if the flashing red light on the ambulance was on. Clark responded, quote, it was off. I think it was off. I think this was part of the decoy, If the flashing red light was on, it would be an indication that this was the ambulance that had the president. But I think that's why they decided to leave it off, end quote. Lifton, quote, so there's absolutely no question in your mind that you lost the ambulance you chased, end quote. Clark, quote, right, end quote. Clark told Lifton that they stayed on the grounds of the hospital, that he thought the ride lasted, quote, 10 to 15 minutes, end quote, and that the truck got up to speeds of 45 or 50 miles per hour. Quote, we followed the ambulance until we lost it, and then it was like something about, I would say, another 15 minutes trying to find, trying to get back to where we started from, end quote. Finally, in 1979, Lifton successfully located both former Air Force Sergeant Richard Goudreau and former Coast Guard yeoman George Barnum. After being prompted, Goudreau did remember chasing an ambulance and said, quote, there was some confusion and we did go off with another ambulance. I can picture us being led somewhere and finding something empty and then being led somewhere else, end quote. It was George Barnum's written report made on November 29, 1963, that summarized what had happened a bit more precisely. Lifton quoted the key passages in Barnum's report pertaining to the ambulance shenanigans as follows. Quote, "We pushed and shoved our way through the crowd," this is after the helicopter landed, "until we were beside the hearse." Barnum clearly meant the gray Navy ambulance because he recalled Jackie Kennedy getting out of that vehicle. Immediately, we were told to get into a pickup truck that was standing by to go to the rear of the hospital. We were following an ambulance that supposedly had the president's casket in it. As we arrived at the rear entrance to the hospital by the morgue, we were informed that the casket had not been driven there. We then jumped back into the pickup and returned to the front of the hospital, and we were told again to return to the rear. We did so, and once again we were informed that the casket was not there. We returned again to the front, and this time police had cleared a path through the people, and the ambulance proceeded to the rear entrance to the morgue. We then proceeded to take the casket into the hospital in an orderly fashion." End quote. This ABC News black and white motion picture footage shows a gray Navy ambulance departing the front of Bethesda Naval Hospital shortly before 8 o'clock p.m. to take the newly rediscovered Dallas casket, now containing the body of JFK again, around to the morgue loading dock. This cannot be the 6:55 p.m. arrival from Andrews Air Force Base because at that time, Greer was driving, not the black driver. And in the front seat at Andrews Air Force Base, seated from left to right as shown here, were the President's military physician, Rear Admiral Berkeley, sitting on the lap of Agent Kellerman, with Secret Service Agent Landis sitting in between Kellerman and Greer. Since Rear Admiral Calvin Galloway, the commanding officer of the Bethesda National Naval Medical Center, can now be seen in the right-hand side of the front seat bench of Ambulance 96, this new footage cannot be from the 6:55 p.m. arrival and must instead have been taken shortly before 8 o'clock p.m. In his book Best Evidence, David Lifton made one mistake regarding the ambulance chase. Whereas a newspaper reporter wrote the next day that Admiral Galloway had slid into the front seat of a Navy ambulance and taken the casket around to the morgue, Lifton expanded the story and actually placed Galloway behind the wheel, even though the newspaper reporter did not say that in his article. And Lifton, therefore, mistakenly identified Galloway as the driver of the gray Navy ambulance leading the casket team astray during the ambulance chase. Lifton connected the dots wrongly, and this motion picture footage proves it. The only safe thing to say today is that we do not know who the driver of the second decoy Navy ambulance was during the ambulance chase. I am happy to report that there have now been located 2 high-quality photographs apparently documenting the 8 o'clock p.m. or 2000 hours military time entry of the Dallas casket at the Bethesda morgue loading dock. They were found in an online, public access photographic archive and have been purchased from that archive that is licensed for private use. They look like they were recorded in a 4-inch by 5-inch photographic format, perhaps in a professional speed graphic or press camera. The focus is very sharp, and the resolution of the 2 digital images found online is very good. If a large film format duplex holder was used, this would perhaps explain why there are only 2 photographs that were found in the archive. A duplex holder only holds 2 pieces of 4 by 5-inch film. Noteworthy features include, first, a gray Navy ambulance is parked deep inside the loading dock in both photos. Second, a gray Navy pickup truck parked in front of the ambulance in each photo is surely the pickup truck that conveyed the Joint Service Casket team that evening all over the grounds of Bethesda. Third, in the first image, members of the Joint Service Casket team can be seen in the background on the loading dock platform, and the rear of the bronze Dallas casket can be seen as it is being taken in a door in the background on the right side of the photograph. The Dallas casket is probably on a wheeled conveyance, like a church truck, since it is not being carried by the casket team members. Fourth, in the second image, the one with a Navy lieutenant approaching the cameraman with an apparent sense of urgency on his face, a black man is standing next to the driver's door of the Navy ambulance. He would appear to be the same black driver who originally drove the cardiac ambulance from Bethesda to Andrews Air Force Base, and who drove up to Air Force One as soon as it landed. Television broadcasts and 16mm film showed the world that the driver and a nurse wearing a white cap vacated the ambulance at Andrews to make room in the front seat for Greer, Landis, Kellerman, and Berkeley. It would make sense that this black man is the same driver who was asked to relinquish the vehicle to the Secret Service at Andrews Air Force Base. Presumably, obviously, both the black driver and the nurse got into other vehicles in the motorcade in order to stay with their vehicle. I conclude that the black driver standing next to the ambulance in the loading dock photo is the same individual who drove the Navy ambulance around shortly before 8 o'clock p.m. from the front of Bethesda to the morgue loading dock for the casket entry seen in these images. He retrieved control of his vehicle shortly before 8 o'clock p.m. and was remaining with it in the loading dock during the casket entry at 8 o'clock p.m. Fifth, a Navy Rear Admiral standing on the loading dock in the background can be seen saluting the casket in both loading dock photos. It appears to be the same Rear Admiral photographed on movie film sitting in the front seat of the Navy ambulance when it departed from the front of the hospital just minutes before this event in the ABC movie footage. The close-ups of this Rear Admiral in both 8 o'clock p.m. photographs appear to be completely consistent with the ABC movie footage of the Rear Admiral in the front seat of the ambulance and with the official photograph of Rear Admiral Calvin B. Galloway. Perhaps most noteworthy of all are the extreme differences between the black Cadillac hearse seen in screen grabs of ABC movie clips and the gray Navy ambulance seen departing the front of Bethesda shortly before 8 o'clock p.m. in the ABC movie footage, and in the two startlingly clear, high-resolution images of the gray Navy ambulance's 8 o'clock p.m. casket entry recently found online and purchased for this documentary. In summary, the three casket entries at Bethesda, 6:35 p.m., 7:17 p.m., and 8 o'clock p.m., were already extremely well documented by means of contemporaneous documents establishing three distinct times, but also through vivid descriptions of the three distinct sets of actors who performed the three casket entries, 7 or 8 Navy sailors, 4 men in suits, and finally the Joint Service Casket team. But now, with these amazing images shown in this documentary, we have photographic corroboration of the third 8 o'clock p.m. casket entry and motion picture film clips showing both a black hearse and Navy sailors in the same loading dock at an unspecified time.
A search was made of all available television footage and still photographs of vehicles arriving at Bethesda and, more important, at the morgue loading dock at the rear. And then the camera cuts to this scene at the morgue loading dock, a line of sailors guarding the area. And then this shot of a black hearse. Is it the hearse that Donald Reventish and Dennis David saw earlier that evening with the shipping casket? Or is it the hearse from a Washington funeral home, which arrived after midnight and which brought the mahogany casket the Kennedy family purchased for the funeral at Arlington National Cemetery? One thing is certain. The film is graphic evidence of numerous witnesses to the events of that evening. Other men who, like Paul O'Connor and Donald Reventish and Dennis David, have a small piece of the puzzle they thought was innocent.
But do the film clips of the black hearse and the Navy sailors document the 6:35 p.m. arrival of the shipping casket? I think not, and there is timeline evidence that pretty much conclusively rules this out. This timeline evidence involves a uniform change made by Major General Wheel and Lieutenant Lipsey sometime between their arrival on the H-21 helicopter at 6:45 p.m. and later in the evening arriving at the morgue loading dock wearing dress blues. Note the shiny gold braid on their uniform sleeves, which does not appear in the clothing they were wearing at 6:45 p.m. when they arrived in the H-21 helicopter, nor shortly before 8 o'clock p.m., which is possibly when they were photographed in front of Bethesda on movie film. This proves that they made a uniform change before JFK's body left Bethesda at 3:56 a.m. to go to the East Room of the White House. This could have been done immediately after the autopsy was concluded and before the embalming of JFK's body was completed. Gawler's personnel worked on the president's body from 11:45 p.m. until 3:30 a.m. So clearly, since Lipsey stayed with JFK's body throughout the autopsy, this time period from 11:45 p.m. to 3:30 a.m. would encompass the only opportunity for the uniform change into dress uniforms, which clearly took place. Color photography clearly shows Wheel and Lipsey in Army dress blues inside the East Room, rendering honors to JFK's body on the catafalque. JFK's body entered the East Room of the White House at 4:34 a.m. on November 23rd.
And then the camera cuts to this scene at the morgue loading dock, a line of sailors guarding the area. And then this shot of a black hearse. Is it the hearse that Donald Rebentish and Dennis David saw earlier that evening with the shipping casket? Or is it the hearse from a Washington funeral home, which arrived after midnight and which brought the mahogany casket the Kennedy family purchased for the funeral at Arlington National Cemetery?
We can safely conclude that the black hearse, which delivered the shipping casket at 6:35 p.m., was from Gawler's funeral home. See Chapter 6 of my book, Inside the ARRB. We also know that this hearse returned to Gawler's funeral home in the middle of the evening so that the Kennedy family could select a different casket for burial. My research has shown that the African mahogany casket in which JFK was to be buried was brought to Bethesda from Gawler's sometime between 12:30 a.m. and 2 o'clock a.m. An examination of the inside of the hearse in this frame grab, seen through the windshield, shows that there is some kind of casket inside the vehicle, presumably the African mahogany casket just brought from Gawler's to Bethesda. The fact that in the same film clip, General Wheel and Lieutenant Lipsey can be seen walking past the Navy sailors proves it is later in the evening, because they have already conducted their uniform change. The obvious conclusion is that these images of the black hearse cannot have been taken at 6:35 p.m. when the shipping casket arrived, but rather were taken between 12:30 a.m. and 2 o'clock in the morning. Therefore, the sailors in the film clips are not necessarily Dennis David's working party from 6:35 p.m., but instead a second group of sailors called upon during the middle of the night, probably waiting to unload the African mahogany burial casket from the hearse into the morgue when it was time to do so. I think it is fair to conclude that the black hearse seen in the film clips is certainly the same hearse used at 6:35 to transport a shipping casket with JFK's body inside from the Officers Club parking lot where the Gawler's hearse met the helicopter that brought JFK's body from Andrews Air Force Base to the morgue loading dock. But the uniform change by General Wheel and Lieutenant Lipsey proves conclusively, in my view, that the hearse photos in the ABC News film clips cannot depict the 6:35 p.m. shipping casket arrival. That event was likely not photographed because it would not have been permitted. Remember, the 6:35 p.m. early arrival of JFK's body in a shipping casket was part of a covert operation involving illicit clandestine surgery to remove metal bullet fragments from JFK's body prior to the autopsy, so that all the evidence of a crossfire in Dealey Plaza could be expunged prior to the beginning of the formal autopsy of record. For more on this, see my presentation on this YouTube channel titled The JFK Medical Cover-Up. The press would not have known about it, and if the press had known about that early arrival prior to the Andrews motorcade, photos would not knowingly have been permitted by Sergeant Boyjan and his security team, nor by Rear Admiral Galloway, for whom the Marines were working that night. So now I believe I have presented to you a responsible and reasonable interpretation of the new images which better illuminate the story of the 3 casket entries into Bethesda Naval Hospital the night of November 22, 1963. It was important to determine what these intriguing images represent and what they do not represent. Late during the production of this program, I became aware of a YouTube interview posted in November of 2023 of a man named Sorrel Schwartz, who claimed to be one of the Navy junior officers on duty the night of November 22, 1963, when the Dallas casket arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Today, Sorrel Schwartz is a retired professor emeritus of pharmacology at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. In August of 1963, following graduate school after he got his Ph.D. in pharmacology, he was commissioned to lieutenant junior grade in the U.S. Navy's Medical Service Corps and was assigned to the Naval Medical Research Institute, or NAMRI, which was located on the grounds of the Bethesda National Naval Medical Center. Lieutenant J.G. Schwartz, who was then 26 years old and had been a naval officer less than 4 months, was unexpectedly added to the NNMC duty watch the day of JFK's assassination. Later that night, he found himself riding on the outside of the pickup truck used to transport the members of the Joint Service Casket Team in the performance of their duties. I contacted Sorrel Schwartz in April of 2025 and conducted an extensive interview of Mr. Schwartz on April 25th. He also shared with me an audio recording of a 30-minute interview he did with NPR Radio in the year 2008. To make a long story short, Sorrel Schwartz has positively identified himself as the Navy Lieutenant Junior grade seen in the 2 Bethesda morgue loading dock photos that I recently licensed for public use. He had never seen the photographs before and was delighted to learn that there was a photographic record of his activity that night. In the first of the 2 photos, he is seen standing in the well of the loading dock next to ambulance number 96, saluting the bronze Dallas casket as JFK's body was taken from the morgue jetty into the hospital. He had no idea at the time that JFK's body was being taken into the hospital for the second time that evening, and he was completely unaware of the 6:35 p.m. arrival of JFK in the shipping casket via the black hearse. In the second of the 2 photos, Sorrel Schwartz is seen face-on approaching the camera. At the time, he was intent upon establishing a perimeter and keeping the press outside of the morgue. In his November 2023 YouTube interview, Schwartz vividly recalled saluting JFK's casket as he stood next to the Navy ambulance. He also explained his role that night and with whom he was working.
We had a guard truck, the other duty officer and I, and then the military honor guard, which is made up of members of the 4 services, Air Force, Navy, Marines. They were on the back of the truck. I was on the running board, and Department of Defense guard was driving, and the other duty officers inside. And we rushed to get the coffin to the morgue and unloaded.
During the course of his YouTube interview, Sorrel Schwartz recalled trying to get to the morgue as soon as possible and how he expected that ambulance number 96, with the Dallas casket inside, would follow his pickup truck to the morgue. Instead, the only two vehicles that followed the casket team's pickup truck were the two staff cars belonging to Brigadier General Godfrey McHugh, JFK's Air Force aide, and Major General Philip Wheel, Commandant of the Military District of Washington. Schwartz explained to me on April 25th that the driver of the pickup truck was a DoD civilian guard and that a Navy 03, a lieutenant, was in the front seat of the cab. Lieutenant Byrd was in the back of the pickup truck with his men, and Schwartz was standing outside the truck on the running board on the left-hand side of the vehicle. Schwartz explained the abortive trip to the morgue in his YouTube interview.
There was an issue before when we first got to the morgue. We were there and the ambulance was supposed to be behind us, but it wasn't. Two cars were behind us. One was the President's Air Force military aide, General McHugh, and the other was the Army Commandant of the Military District of Washington, General, I think it's Well, if I recall his name. We didn't know what happened, where the ambulance was. And we almost got into a little bit of trouble because General McHugh was somewhat touchy that night, asked us if we knew what the hell we were doing. And we gave a response which is not the type of response that a junior officer gives a general officer. So General McHugh was about to say, "Who do you think you're talking to?" But he didn't quite finish it because General Well, I think that was his name, who outranked him by 1 star, said, "Hey, General, let them do their job." And so we probably escaped getting put on report or some other type of disciplinary action because he was quite annoyed with us. And what had happened was at Andrews, the Navy driver of the ambulance was replaced by a Secret Service driver. So when we said that we were going to go to the morgue, our truck took off, the two generals' cars took off, and the ambulance didn't take off because crowd around it, and he didn't know the way to the morgue. So we came back and we did this all over again. During the time when we were trying to find out what happened, I had made a comment, "I can't believe we've lost the body of the president."
As you can see, Schwartz vividly recalled General McHugh getting very upset with the Navy. Although he did not specify exactly why McHugh got so upset, he did admit in both the YouTube interview and in his earlier NPR interview in 2008 that the casket team and the two generals had, quote, lost the body of the president, end quote, and had to regroup. On the way back to the front of the hospital, Schwartz said they stopped off at the emergency room and determined that JFK's casket was definitely not there. In this final audio excerpt from his YouTube interview, Mr. Schwartz fully endorsed author William Manchester's description of the casket team's activities in his book, Death of a President.
The one accurate description of what went on when we had lost the body, when the ambulance didn't follow us to the morgue, was in William Manchester's book, The Death of a President, where he very accurately described what went on while we were trying to figure out where the ambulance was. He had gotten that from interviewing the Army's first lieutenant, who was the Army officer in charge of the honor guard. That was, his representation was accurate.
By these statements, Sorrel Schwartz seemed to be fully endorsing what Manchester had written on page 399 about finding an empty, unattended Navy ambulance at the morgue loading dock. That conundrum would certainly seem to explain why General McHugh had gotten upset with the Navy that night, causing him to ask, quote, "Do you people know what the hell you are doing?" End quote. However, when I reviewed the audio from Schwartz's 2008 NPR interview, I became aware that he claimed to have discovered the empty, unattended Navy ambulance about 100 yards away from the morgue loading dock.
The next thing that was supposed to happen was that the ambulance would take the casket of the president from the entrance of the hospital around to the other side, to the morgue. Sorrell joined other officers, and they jumped in a truck to head off and begin making way for the ambulance to pass through.
And we rushed around to the morgue, and it was my idea. We had to get to the morgue before we got these big crowds moving over into that area, and we didn't want to get a lot of pictures and interference. And
so you wanted to get there ahead of the ambulance, is that right?
Yeah, we wanted to get the ambulance would follow us. So we got to the morgue. We got out, and we're looking, and we don't see any ambulance. There's no ambulance behind us. And we're looking and looking. And so we look down the road and we look across and we see an ambulance. I mean, it's sitting there in the dark. It's about 100 yards away from us. And so we walked down, and it wasn't the ambulance. I mean, it was an empty, turned off ambulance. Its hood was cold, and we came back up to the morgue platform.
Still not entirely sure where the ambulance was.
We had no idea
Kennedy's
what was
casket.
going on.
Okay.
What we did learn, by the way, was that a Secret Service agent drove the ambulance. As it turns out, what had happened is that we took off too fast and didn't realize that we had said we're going to the morgue, but failed to make sure that he knew where the morgue was. And so we're retracing our steps, and I thought, well, maybe he went to the emergency room. So we stop at the emergency room, and there are nurses and doctors who are sort of standing at the entrance of the emergency room looking at us. They're sort of trying to find out what's going on. And I said to her, a nurse, I said, they didn't bring the president's body by here, did they? And she looked at me like, what are you talking about? And so obviously they hadn't. So as we drive away, I said, I can't believe we've lost the body of the president. And the enlisted men on the truck started to laugh. And then, of course, everybody realized that this was not the time to be laughing. And I was sort of a little bit ashamed of the gallows humor, but I forgave myself quickly.
As a result, I questioned Schwartz extensively on April 25th about exactly where the empty ambulance was discovered. He clarified that it was adjacent to the motor pool. I even read to him the William Manchester account on page 399 of his book. Schwartz now insisted, contrary to his earlier praise in 2023 for Death of a President, that Manchester's account did not agree with his memory of where the empty ambulance was found. I then had a frank discussion with Sorrell Schwartz about the problems faced by historians and investigators when they encounter conflicting accounts of the same event by different eyewitnesses. I said to him, quote, Manchester interviewed General Wheel and Lieutenant Byrd in April of 1964, just 5 months after JFK's assassination, and he wrote his account on page 399 based upon their recollections. Your differing account, namely that the empty Navy ambulance was found about 100 yards away from the morgue loading dock, was recorded 44 years later in 2008. Which account should I find the most credible? End quote. Schwartz told me that while his memory was firm, he would not have his feelings hurt if I chose to believe the two people interviewed in 1964 instead of his differing account 44 years later. And of course, your memories are your own. Those are your memories. And here's the problem that, as somebody who used to work on the review board staff and who interviewed all kinds of witnesses like Humes, Boswell, Fink, which we deposed under oath, the two FBI agents at the autopsy, we deposed them under oath, the x-ray technicians, we deposed many others, and we interviewed others that were not under oath, but we did a lot of interviews, including Dr. Carney, who was the duty resident that night. And they all had slightly different memories of things, and I became accustomed to the fact that that will happen years later. So here's my problem, Sorrell, as somebody who's just trying to fill in the blanks in his own understanding. Manchester interviewed Lieutenant Byrd, the officer in charge of the Casket team, and General Wheel in April of 1964. He interviewed them immediately. I mean, very soon after the events that occurred. He interviewed them both in April '64, and that's how he got what he used to write his account, the one I just read you. And your interview with NPR, don't get defensive, I'm just pointing out something, was 44 years later. And so I'm trying to figure out which account I should believe, and right now I don't know what to do.
Yeah, well, that of course, I'm 87 years old, and if I were you, I'd say, I'm talking to an 87-year-old trying to recall 62 years ago, and I talked to people who actually, 4 months after things happened, who do I believe? So you don't have to worry about this talking to me. I completely understand.
In summary, I do believe the account in Manchester's book on page 399 because it came from the 2 officers in charge of the casket team, just 5 months after the event transpired. There was another problem with Schwartz's memory. He remembers nothing about an ambulance chase, even though General Wheel and every member of the casket team did remember that the pickup truck followed an ambulance and got lost in the darkness. That's 7 witnesses who eloquently remembered following an ambulance, and only one, Sorrel Schwartz, who doesn't. Summing up, while my contact with Sorrel Schwartz was friendly and he was cooperative and tried to be helpful, there are holes in his memory. To wit, he was unaware of the delivery of a shipping casket by a Cadillac hearse at 6:35 p.m. He was furthermore unaware of the first delivery of the Dallas casket at 7:17 p.m. by 4 federal agents. His point of view in his memory was clearly on the action and expected action behind the casket team's pickup truck. The fact that only 2 staff cars followed the pickup truck on its first trip to the morgue and his expectation that Navy Ambulance number 96 should have been following his pickup truck. His point of view at the time these events transpired made him unaware of what was happening in front of the pickup truck. He remembers nothing about an ambulance chase before arriving at the morgue loading dock, and yet 7 other people who were involved do remember the pickup truck following ambulance number 95 in the darkness, behind Bethesda Naval Hospital. Coast Guard Petty Officer George Barnum's 1963 written report of events that night provides one possible explanation that may accommodate part of Sorrel Schwartz's memories. Barnum, you will recall, wrote that the casket team made 2 separate trips to the back of the hospital before later finding the Dallas casket in a Navy ambulance in front of the hospital shortly before 8 o'clock p.m. If Barnum's account is correct, and it is a contemporaneous document written on November 29, 1963, then both the Manchester account of finding the empty ambulance at the loading dock and Schwartz's account of finding an empty ambulance 100 yards from the loading dock could both possibly be true. The 2 events might possibly have occurred during different trips to the rear of the hospital, with Schwartz remembering only the second event. The bottom line for me is that the Wheel and Bird interviews by Manchester in April of 1964 cannot be overturned by a contrary memory by Sorrel Schwartz, first recorded 44 years later. Perhaps the biggest memory hole for Sorrel Schwartz is the fact that in the face of persistent questioning by me on April 25th, 2025, he said he could not remember exactly why General Godfrey McHugh got so upset with the Navy and had to be calmed down by General Wheel, nor could he remember where or when that happened. The most logical explanation for McHugh being so upset is the one provided by William Manchester's account. That is, finding an empty ambulance at the morgue loading dock with no casket inside. Evaluating the memories of Sorrel Schwartz is illustrative of how the investigator or historian cannot build a case on what any single eyewitness says. Instead, judgments must be made based upon the weight of all the available evidence. I'd like to say something else at this time about FBI agents Sibert and O'Neill. It's clear to me that from the time they deposited the Dallas casket, the bronze casket, onto the floor of the morgue anteroom at 7:17 p.m., they were not allowed to enter the morgue. The CBS memo makes clear that they were not allowed into the morgue, at least not initially, and that they were kept in the anteroom. It's also obvious in retrospect that they were sequestered somewhere else down the hall. I mean, they couldn't be allowed to see the Joint Service Casket Team bringing the Dallas casket back into the morgue, since they had already brought it into the morgue themselves.
So he and I and Jim and Greer opened the back of the ambulance. We took the casket out and put it on a conveyance.
Of course, I've read some stuff about teams and stuff, and I don't have any recollection of any teams. I recall there was Kellerman and Greer, there was a driver, O'Neill and myself, but we carried it through the door and right on into the autopsy room, sort of an ante room there, I think.
But it's highly likely that they were admitted entry into the morgue proper right after the honor guard had set the bronze casket down inside the morgue next to an examining table. Richard Lipsey is publishing a book this year in 2025, and he recently conducted an interview on June the 10th, 2025, about the contents of his book. This Richard Lipsey soundbite from his June 10th, 2025 interview reinforces the statement of Dr. Humes, recorded in the 1967 CBS memo, namely that the two FBI agents were excluded from the morgue for an unspecified amount of time and kept in an anteroom. This recollection by Richard Lipsey reinforces that 1967 statement by Dr. Humes and contradicts later embellished claims by Frank O'Neill and James Sibert that they went immediately into the morgue proper with the Dallas casket at 7:17 p.m. and that no one prevented them from entering the morgue proper after they delivered the Dallas casket from the loading dock to the morgue anteroom. So here's the Richard Lipsey soundbite.
There were two FBI guys right outside the door, but they weren't allowed in.
You'll recall that earlier we examined the Rosen report, written by Inspector Rosen in 1964, when he interviewed Sibert and O'Neill about their interactions with Arlen Specter. And in the Rosen report, there are two key times listed. One time of 7:17 p.m. for the time of preparation for the autopsy, and another time of 8:15 p.m. for when the autopsy started. When the time of the first Dallas casket entry, 7:17 p.m., is compared with the time the autopsy started, 8:15 p.m., it is quite apparent that this considerable delay, almost exactly 1 hour, documents approximately how long the two FBI agents were kept outside the morgue proper. So they may very well have seen JFK's body removed from the Dallas casket, from the bronze casket, shortly after 8 o'clock, as long as they were not allowed to see the Joint Service Casket Team bring that casket in. Dr. Humes obviously lied to his neighbor, as recorded in the CBS memo, when he said they were never in the morgue. That can't be true because they wrote an FD 302 report quoting things that he said during the autopsy, and they took voluminous notes. So when Humes said they were never in the morgue, he was exaggerating. They were not in the morgue initially during the clandestine operations on JFK's body, but they were clearly in the morgue from 8 o'clock on. They were also there to witness his summation at 11 o'clock p.m., and then they left to go to the FBI laboratory with two tiny metal bullet fragments. So I just want to restate here that the language in their FD 302 report about a tight security being placed around the autopsy room by the U.S. Navy and the Secret Service is a gentlemanly way, a bureaucratic way of saying they wouldn't let us go in. And they had apparently a tense discussion with Kellerman about it. And apparently they were told, well, you can't go in. They're preparing for the autopsy. There's nothing happening right now. We'll come back and get you later before the autopsy begins, but you can't go in now. They're preparing for the autopsy. I know for a fact that after David Lifton published his book and quoted their FD 302 report and inferred that they were denied immediate entry into the morgue, they took great objection to this because they never wanted to admit that they had lost control of the chain of custody on JFK's body. They certainly didn't want to admit that they had brought in an empty casket along with Kellerman and Greer. And they started stonewalling as soon as Lifton's book was published in 1981. So by the time the review board took their depositions, they were actually embellishing their story and telling lies. They were both telling the ARRB that they took the casket directly into the morgue and then it was opened. And I just know that's not true. It's not true based on the language in their FD 302 report. And it's not true based upon what Dr. Humes told his neighbor, which was recorded in the CBS memo, namely that they were kept out of the morgue and sequestered in an anteroom. So both O'Neill and Sibert, particularly Frank O'Neill, had a very strong animus for David Lifton and started modifying his story as soon as best evidence came out because they never wanted to admit that they were bamboozled by the Secret Service and that they carried an empty casket into the morgue anteroom and then were denied entry into the morgue, and they never wanted to admit that they were separated from that casket, surely taken down the hall, because they never witnessed the Joint Service Casket Team take the casket into the morgue proper and set it down next to an examining table. I'm pretty sure that they were recalled to the morgue as soon as the Joint Service Casket Team set the bronze casket down shortly after 8 o'clock p.m. next to an examining table, and then the Joint Service Casket Team departed the morgue proper and positioned themselves in the hallway outside the morgue. That's probably the exact time when the FBI agents were recalled, and I don't have much doubt in my mind that they did witness. The lid opened up on the bronze casket, and they did witness JFK's body placed on an examining table shortly after 8 o'clock p.m. But their denials that they were ever separated from the casket to the review board, and their claims to the review board that the casket was open immediately when they took it in are nonsense, because they're disproven by the after-action report of the Joint Service Casket Team, which says they didn't take the casket in until 2000 hours. So Sibert and O'Neill were telling the truth when they were interviewed by the HSCA, and they mentioned only 4 federal agents taking the casket into the morgue. The story was very simple. There was nobody helping them, and they didn't start confabulating stories about others possibly helping them until 1997, when they were intent upon refuting Lifton's book, and they were intent upon defending themselves and hiding from history the fact that they lost control of the chain of custody on JFK's body. I want to offer up a brief summation of the 3 casket entries at this time. As the graphic on the screen shows, the shipping casket entered once at 6:35 p.m. and the bronze Dallas casket entered Bethesda Naval Hospital twice, at approximately 7:17 p.m. and again at 8 o'clock p.m. The first time the Dallas casket entered, it was empty. The second time it entered, at 8 o'clock p.m., JFK's body had just been reintroduced into the casket after the completion of clandestine post-mortem surgery to remove as many bullet fragments as possible from JFK's body. Incidentally, this is probably when the Dallas casket was damaged. Author William Manchester probably got this wrong in his book, because General Godfrey McHugh told David Lifton he did not see any damage to the bronze casket until the 8 o'clock p.m. casket entry, in which he participated. I explained the importance of the 6:35 to 8 o'clock p.m. interruption of the chain of custody for JFK's body to Chairwoman Luna of the Task Force on the Declassification of Federal Secrets when I testified at a public hearing on May 20th, 2025.
What is the evidence that you refer to about an interruption of chain of custody of President Kennedy's body prior to the start of the autopsy shortly after 8 p.m.?
Right. Yeah. Because of this venue and this format, I'll have to give you a streamlined answer. I'm sure everyone will appreciate that. We know for a fact that the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base with a bronze Dallas casket in it arrived in front of Bethesda at 6:55 p.m. Remember that time. That's documented by the Secret Service report of Agent Clint Hill and by newspaper reporters. But the review board obtained an extremely important document written by a Marine Corps non-commissioned officer, Sergeant Boyjan of the United States Marine Corps. He led a team of Marines from the Marine barracks in Washington, D.C. to provide physical security at the autopsy. This was not the honor guard in dress uniforms. These were Marines from the Marine barracks to provide physical security. He wrote a report of what happened that night, and he wrote in his report dated November 26th, 1963, he wrote that, and he's only talking about what happened with the president because that was his job, was to guard the president's body during the autopsy. He wrote that the casket arrived at 1835 hours. 1835 hours. That's 6:35 p.m., 20 minutes before the motorcade from Andrews arrived. And there is a considerable amount of evidence, a wide range of evidence, that the president's body really arrived by helicopter before the motorcade from Andrews. That's the broken chain of custody. The issue here is, if Sergeant Boyjan's report is correct, and he authenticated that to the review board staff, he authenticated that to me with a written letter and with a telephone interview. If his report is correct, then what was happening with the president's body between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock when the autopsy of record started? That's almost an hour and a half. And the simple answer, the streamlined answer, appears to be that many metal fragments were removed from President Kennedy's body before the autopsy of record began. We have witnesses for this.
Those would be the bullet fragments, correct?
Yes. Tom Robinson of Gawler's Funeral Home saw a vial full of 10 tiny fragments, which he saw picked out of President Kennedy's brain. They were never placed in the record. Dennis David, HM1 Corpsman Dennis David, typed a receipt for a federal agent of 4 large bullet fragments. He thought it would be mass larger than 1 bullet and less mass than 2 bullets, somewhere between 1 and 2 bullets, 4 large fragments. He typed the receipt. He was allowed to handle the fragments by the federal agent. We wouldn't do that today. And the agent took the receipt, the typewriter ribbon, and the fragments, and they were never introduced in the record. So we also have 2 witnesses. To make a long story short, we have 2 witnesses to surgery on the cranium to get this evidence out. And Dr. Humes, the chief pathologist, said under oath that I never had to perform a craniotomy. I never had to saw the skull open to get the brain out. And when Dr. Fink arrived late for the autopsy, he was the outsider, the Army guy, arrived at 8:30. Humes told Dr. Fink no sawing of the skull was necessary. So the end of my response here is that we have 2 witnesses, X-ray technician Ed Reed, under oath to the review board, and Tom Robinson, to both the House committee and to the review board. Tom Robinson told the same account to both the HSCA and to us that he saw Dr. Humes saw the skull open. So I think bullet fragments were removed from the president's body before the autopsy of record began, and that's why we should have no confidence whatsoever in the autopsy. When Chairwoman Luna asked me at the May 20th, 2025 hearing to explain the chain of custody problem with President Kennedy's body, time constraints precluded me from giving her all of the evidence. So I'd like to conclude here by discussing the body bag problem. There were 5 credible witnesses who unequivocally described President Kennedy's body arriving in a zippered body bag. The reason that's important is because when President Kennedy's body left Parkland Hospital, his body was wrapped in a sheet and another sheet was wrapped around his head. But that's not the condition seen by these 5 witnesses. They all recalled seeing him removed from a zippered body bag. So the first 2 of these 5 witnesses were Navy Corpsman Paul O'Connor and Navy Corpsman Floyd Reeby. In addition, Navy Captain John Stover, the commanding officer of the Naval Medical School of Bethesda, also recalled a zippered body bag, and so did Gawler's mortician John Van Heusen when interviewed by the ARRB. Finally, U.S. Army First Lieutenant Richard Lipsey has stated at least twice that I know of that he personally helped remove JFK's body from a zippered body bag inside the morgue. If these recollections do not constitute a chain of custody problem, I don't know what does. Those in the research community who have been in denial about the 3 casket entries and what they portend, namely clandestine postmortem surgery on the president's wounds at Bethesda to gain access to bullet fragments and the subsequent removal of all large bullet fragments from his body prior to the commencement of the autopsy of record shortly after 8 o'clock p.m., really have no leg to stand on at this point. The 3 casket entries are well set apart from each other by the distinct and well-documented times when they each occurred, and by the distinct and well-established set of different actors who carried out each of the 3 casket entries. You cannot conduct a crime scene investigation without establishing a timeline. There is much more to this case than the observations of the wounds by different witnesses at the autopsy of record after 8 o'clock p.m. that night. There was considerable forensic activity that night at Bethesda Naval Hospital prior to 8 o'clock p.m. with regard to the president's body. My presentation on this YouTube channel, titled The JFK Medical Cover-Up, makes that absolutely clear. Those who wish to ignore the timeline of the 3 Bethesda casket entries because it seems confusing to them or unseemly prove themselves to be mere dilettantes who are unqualified to explain the broad tapestry and context of all of the events at Bethesda Naval Hospital the night of the autopsy. Let me give one example of this. One JFK researcher recently made a ridiculous statement in his presentation at a Dallas conference in November of 2024. He said that the new photos depicting the 8 o'clock p.m. casket entry at the morgue loading dock proved to him that JFK's body could not have been in the shipping casket at 6:35 p.m. This unwarranted conclusion on his part demonstrated shallow thinking and a failure to consider other key evidence in the case. Specifically, Dr. Fink's notes to General Bloomberg in 1965 made clear that Dr. Humes called him at 8 o'clock p.m. and asked him to participate in the autopsy. At the Shaw trial in 1969, and later, before the HSCA forensic panel, Dr. Fink explained that when Humes called him on the phone at 8 o'clock p.m., Humes told Fink that he, quote, already had a good set of skull films, end quote. And in this context, Humes solicited Fink's assistance. Since it took about 30 minutes just to develop the skull x-rays, per the sworn ARRB testimony of Navy X-ray tech Gerald Custer, 8 o'clock p.m., therefore, could not have been the first time JFK's body entered Bethesda Naval Hospital. This crucial timeline observation by Dr. Fink proves that JFK's body arrived much earlier that night. It would not only have taken 30 minutes to develop a set of 5 or 6 skull x-rays, but setup time prior to that, positioning the head, and positioning each of the 5 cassettes in the morgue itself would have taken additional amounts of time beyond the 30 minutes for developing. Abject denial of the more sordid implications of the early arrival of JFK's body at Bethesda, 85 minutes prior to the 3rd casket entry at 8 o'clock p.m., performed by the Joint Service Casket Team, is disqualifying for many who consider themselves medical experts on the JFK autopsy. There is much more wrong with the JFK autopsy than mere incompetence, the excuse favored by Michael Bodden and many of the old guard researchers. The JFK autopsy of record, which began shortly after 8 o'clock p.m., was a complete sham from start to finish because of the wound tampering and bullet removal from JFK's body and brain that had occurred between 6:35 and 8 o'clock p.m. The JFK autopsy of record between 8 o'clock p.m. and 11:45 p.m. was conducted on a body that was, in effect, a sanitized crime scene. Understanding the timeline of the 3 Bethesda casket entries is the linchpin to properly understanding what a travesty JFK's autopsy of record really was between 8 o'clock and 11:45 p.m. History has spoken, and it has spoken with a loud and clear voice.
Thank you very much.